Often when I mention preparing to live off-grid in the desert, it raises eyebrows. Water is the most obvious essential thing to have access to in a dry climate, but something else often overlooked for long-term survival in a place such as West Texas is growing your own crops. Even if you plan to primarily eat your survival stash of freeze-dried delicacies and things packaged by someone else, all those buckets of cheesy broccoli soup and chili mac you bought in 2020, the more you can supplement these foodstuffs with things you can grow by your own hand from your own land, the longer you can make your food supplies last. Not to mention, it would probably be better for your health and avoiding food monotony. Today I'm talking growing food as the indigenous people once did long ago, even in your area, so you'll be ready for the apocalypse. You can't homestead in the desert because you can't grow food there. Hello, fellow mutants. One of the misconceptions around gardening is that it's impossible to sustain you if you're not living as a member of a mag in the land of milk and honey in some place like the Ozarks, where people spend all day pickling the eggs they harvested from their chickens or performing a communal barn raising Amish style. If you go in with only the knowledge of plants in your local Lowe's garden center and a standard European gardening mindset, you may be discouraged from the idea of sustaining yourself with crops you grow yourself. After all, many vegetables like cucumbers have a very low calorie content anyway. Both ancient knowledge and modern technology, however, make even desert farming not only possible, but potentially rewarding and fruitful, pun intended. While I recommend you look up the specifics of your own local area, unless you live in Death Valley or the hinterlands of Alaska, there are people who came before who knew how to survive off the land where you are. Why try to replicate a garden from Connecticut when you live in the Atchafalaya swamp in Louisiana? Today I'll be focusing on one specific aspect of desert gardening, but I hope it gives you some ideas, or perhaps you have some to share in the comments, about crops and techniques that can work for you in an off-grid land wherever you might find yourself headed for your bug-out destination, or if you're there already. But let's talk about waffle gardens first. No, not literal waffles, that would be something. Even those with no exposure to desert agriculture may have learned in grade school about the desert archaic peoples or Pueblo Indians. These Native Americans learned over thousands of years how to adapt to life in a dry, hot climate. They learned how to grow crops in the desert and use irrigation methods and even canal systems, see the Tigua Indians, for example, to feed communities of hundreds or even thousands of people in permanent settlements in areas many consider inhospitable today. We like to think that our modern innovations such as solar power, greenhouses, and drip irrigation tube technology make all of those ways antiquated and unnecessary, that we can artificially create the conditions required for effective gardening in any location. But the problem I have with that approach, coming from the mindset of someone prepping for the apocalypse, is heavy reliance on what might end up being very short-lived, modern, technical equipment prone to breaking or failing. Imagine a fan for your greenhouse powered by a solar panel that fails a year or so after societal collapse and grid down. You won't be able to hop onto Amazon with your smartphone and order a replacement or some new parts to fix it. And these methods of farming also tend to be focused on growing things people are used to eating from the supermarkets today. Tomatoes or eggplants, for example. Plants that, if your setup fails, may have little to no chance of being maintained, even with the best ancient techniques, because these plants were never meant to survive in your area, or an area like it. If you can't order a replacement for a damaged T-connector for your irrigation system, your greenhouse filled with tomatoes could fail catastrophically. But what if you could take the best of both worlds, some new technology where it makes sense, modern chemicals, and vast stores of knowledge of modern generations on how to grow plants successfully, combined with the techniques of old and the seeds of ancient crops? You might give yourself a boost in production that the ancients never had, but still have a fail-safe in case anything goes wrong with the plants and techniques proven in your area. You could give yourself an edge that, while not necessarily needed or appreciated today in a world of plenty, could be vital to your survival after a societal collapse. Developed by Puebloan peoples, waffle gardening is an old technique that can be combined with modern drip irrigation, especially if your water source is limited in, say, a tank. Raised square-shaped walls are created by packing clay earth in a design resembling a waffle with sunken cells in between, and amending the inside of the cells with sand and compost. Out in Sierra Blanca, I could take advantage of some of the presents left by free-range cattle and make some manure compost of my own by stacking it in a contained area and letting the heat of the desert do the rest. Waffle gardens are a type of indigenous agricultural system that was used by many Native American tribes, including, but perhaps most famously, the Zuni. The Zuni tribe, of course, is still very much alive and thriving today. They're a sovereign nation located in western New Mexico and have a population of over 10,000 people. Their waffle garden system helped to conserve water and prevent soil erosion and allowed for the efficient use of limited water resources. Corn or other crops like squash or beans could be grown in these water-retaining cells, and there are other less well-known crops I'll mention in a bit. Note that for the plants you're used to, like beans, you may want to be picky about the varieties you choose for low water requirements or drought tolerance, even in a well-maintained garden. Oaxacan Green Dent and Hopi Blue are two varieties of heirloom corn, or maize, to grow with drought tolerance, for example. These may not be the type of corn you'd boil and eat like a typewriter, but they can be ground into corn flour for tortillas. Now, I'm not going to pretend as if I've been out to Zuni land and spoken with members of that tribe and gleaned such valuable information from them directly. Though I do hope to do something like that someday, if they'll have me. But for now, I rely on my obsessive research and my own knowledge of gardening. I have grown over 24 very specific and different types of fruit-bearing trees and shrubs in Texas with good success, and some misses, and have done drip irrigation, raised beds, hydroponics, and common rows and furrows for vegetables. The waffle garden approach intrigues me since it's a specialized approach that is counterintuitive, since you usually want well-drained soil. In this case, you want your plant at a low point where it can benefit from collected water instead, since the rain comes rarely in the desert. If you were to try this approach in a wet area like Louisiana, you'd flood the plant, rot out the roots, and encourage disease, unless you find a local plant suited to having wet feet. The problem for me in making this a reality beyond what I've observed and researched is that my bug-out properties are too far from where I live to manage the plants for now. Even with a very slow drip irrigation system, there's no escaping weeding either. The best planted gardens can quickly become havens for opportunistic native weeds to grow unless you use chemicals. If you travel to Sierra Blanca's sunset ranches, you'll see how after a few good rains, the area will transform from a dry and brittle-looking place to one of almost lush greenery. So this is something I'll need to work on as I build a more permanent place to live out in the Chihuahuan desert. Perhaps I'll carve out the driest part of my current property in East Texas to try out the waffle garden with the hopes that we don't get any hurricanes or week-long rainstorms, as that can often happen. If you wish to go one step further in your selection of crop seeds, you can explore historical crops. You can look into places like Native Seeds Search, a Tucson-based seed conservation nonprofit which has almost 2,000 varieties adapted to dry weather. Many seeds come directly from heirlooms kept by Native American tribes. I've seen some evidence that mega farm corporations want to impose restrictions on seed trading, so it might be wise to get on the action now before heavy-handed corporate government overreach regulates these sort of seed banks out of reach. You can also encourage growth of native plants with some supplemental water or amended soil. If you are lucky with your plot of land, you may need to do very little aside from recognize the edible plants around you. Prickly pear, agave, sunflowers, tansy mustard, or some of the plants the Native Americans ate that grew around them. You're likely familiar with the first few, but tansy mustard, which is generally considered a weed since overgrazing on it by cattle can be toxic to them, has a seed that tastes like mustard and can be used to add flavor to soups or corn. The young leaves, while bitter, can also be boiled and eaten. The benefit of growing native plants is that, like an established fruit tree, they need relatively little care as compared to something that comes from a completely different climate and part of the world. Speaking of fruit trees, that's something I know more than a little about, but I may save that for a future video before I get too deep. If you do have issues with pests or keeping your plants well fertilized or properly fed with the right nutrients, you can stockpile some chemicals. Chemicals for gardening tend to have a rather good shelf life, and limited stock can be extended with careful use. Things like ironite, blood meal, Sevin dust, fish emulsion. You can fit most of these into a portable carry container to take out to your bug-out land. Drip irrigation is a frugal way of keeping plants watered that involves connecting small black tubes with nozzles you can place where you want to slowly be directed and applied or dripped to the roots of the plants. Since casually spraying a hose over a plant is likely to result in water loss and little direct water to the target plant's roots in a sunny and dry environment, getting water where needed is key. A slow drip right at the base of the plant achieves this. Drip technology is often used in container gardening, but is great for arid climates as well. The nozzles can be adjusted for a heavy or light drip, and a variety of tubes, connectors, and nozzle types and designs are available. If you have a large water tank on your land, you could split some off for drip irrigation and control it so it uses very little water or only when needed. Other edible plants you could grow or encourage if already on your property include amaranth. The edible parts are the seeds, which are consumed whole, toasted, or milled into flour. Cylindropuntia leptocollis, the desert Christmas cactus, the berries of which have a taste similar to strawberries. Mesquite. The seeds inside the seed pods can be ground into a powder and mixed with water. Yucca. Many parts of the yucca plant can be consumed, and even non-edible parts were used to make baskets and other items by Native Americans. Cholla cactus. The buds can be harvested. No, this is not the Urban Dictionary definition of cholla. Tepary beans. A drought-resistant type of bean harvested by natives since pre-Columbian times. Note, there are a few plants in the desert to avoid eating as well, and I suggest you do a little research on that just to be safe. Whatever you choose, don't expect your first time gardening in the desert, or anywhere for that matter, to produce a bountiful harvest. Native Americans adapted to living and farming in the desert over thousands of years. Native Americans adapted to living and farming in the desert over thousands of years as their climate changed around them. Hudspeth County and other parts of the Chihuahuan Desert, even just your own plot of land, will have its climate and microclimate that may require a little more or less water for certain types of plants. Your soil may need more or less amendment than soil somewhere in Arizona or New Mexico. It may drain better or worse. Your journey will be to find out what the optimal balance is on different parts of your land and what crops you enjoy eating best. After all, if you won't eat it, what's the use in growing it? Just try to stay away from temperamental or difficult crops just because they're familiar to you. Try some new things, and try different ways of preparing them. You can pop amaranth seed, for example, and make a honeyed treat. As to preparing and eating it, you have another advantage over people of the past. While Native Americans may have needed to spend hours grinding corn or other seeds into flour or meal using primitive materials, you can simply purchase an electric mill, or even a mechanical manual grain grinder for when the grid is down, like this one here. Lastly, I talked a lot about technological advantages and shared knowledge, but it's worth noting that non-native plants can also be an advantage if they are suited to the climate. Native Americans never had the option of ordering a drought-tolerant tree from China, for example. A jujube is a good example of a non-native fruit tree that could do well in a dry, arid climate with some supplemental watering, at least until it's well established. Similarly, in your area, you could make use of many non-native fruit trees suited to your area. Don't assume that they all will do well just based on temperature ranges, though. Some trees, like peaches or plums, may suffer from fungus or other diseases if grown in a humid, wet environment. And other fruit trees require a specific number of chill hours under a certain temperature to bear fruit, while still others might need a pollinator. I may do another video on that topic, as I mentioned, someday soon, especially if you're interested. In summary, don't let gardening in the dry climate of West Texas, or for that matter, the bitter cold half the year in some northern climate, discourage you. These places may have been intimidating to farm for European immigrants in the past. Those who traveled into the American Southwest hundreds of years ago and met them likely marveled at the Pueblo Indians' ability to live in the harsh climate at all, much less raise crops. Any such immigrants to these lands, farmed from antiquity, would have found the going rough if they had taken only the knowledge of their European ancestors to raise vegetables in the desert. The difference for Americans today is that you don't have to arrive on your plot of land like you're an amateur starring in an episode of Alone, scrounging for something edible through trial and error, or Martha Stewart trying to make a New England-style garden work in the desert with a complex or expensive setup. You don't need to wait for thousands of years of knowledge to arrive the old-fashioned way either. In fact, the modern conveniences of technology, the ability to transport hundreds of gallons of inexpensive water at once with powerful 4x4 pickup trucks, and the vast resources of knowledge or even seed and plant cuttings available through books or on the internet give you an edge that no one historically has had. So don't let someone tell you you can't raise a garden in the desert or anywhere else. Well, except perhaps Antarctica. Well, that's all I have for today. Until next time, it's Copper Mutant, signing out.